Our distinguished chair, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to address this important conference on countering narco-terrorism. Narco-terrorism is not just a peripheral issue, it is one of the defining security challenges of our times. It cannot be seen merely as a matter of policing or criminal law. It is above all this a national security challenge. At its core, narco-terrorism is about funding for violence. Narcotics generates illicit profits that sustain arms procurement, recruitment, logistics, propaganda, and extremist networks. If terrorism is to be countered effectively, its financial arteries must be targeted with equal determination. India's geography makes this challenge particularly acute. We lie, as you are all aware, between the Golden Crescent to the west and the Golden Triangle to the east. This places us in a position of natural vulnerability. India can be used as a transit route, a distribution space, and increasingly even a processing hub, especially with the rise of synthetic drugs. This movement is not limited to land borders. It flows across maritime routes, ports, informal trade channels, and now even digital financial systems. Narco-terrorism, therefore, is not a border problem alone. It's a problem of networks, of trafficking, finance, and violence. From experience, one lesson stands out clearly. No insurgency or terrorist movement can sustain itself without reliable finance. Weapons, recruitment, logistics, communication, all this requires money. Narcotics provides a source of funding that is scalable, clandestine, and transnational. That is why criminal networks and violent movements often converge. One brings money, the other brings protection. One controls routes, and the other enforces them. This convergence is the essence of narco-terrorism. In the Indian context, this is particularly relevant in the Northeast. Many insurgent networks in the region have over time drawn sustenance, directly or indirectly, from narcotics-linked finance and illicit commerce. Once violence acquires an economic base, as it has done in many of our prone areas, terrorist-prone areas such as Jammu and Kashmir, it becomes far more difficult to end. The conflict is no longer driven only by grievances or ideology. It is then sustained by profit. This is important when we examine the current instability in the Northeast and its adjoining areas. Armed groups seek to preserve capability, retain influence, and keep future options open. For that, they require funds, routes, and networks. Narcotics finance provides precisely all this. We must therefore understand instability in such regions, not only through political or ethnic lenses, but also through the prism of illicit financial ecosystems. A similar concern arises when we look at the wider vulnerable arc across eastern and northern India. The Siliguri corridor, the Indo-Nepal border, the Bihar-Nepal interface, area of the state where I am serving at the moment, the Simanchal area, and the India-Bangladesh and India-Bhutan boundaries together form a very sensitive belt. These are areas where movement is high, regulation is comparatively uneven, and informal systems often operate alongside formal ones. In such spaces, narcotics money does not remain confined to trafficking. It can also sustain underground networks, facilitate radical ecosystems, and support anti-state activity under various covers. If the state does not dominate the financial space, it will eventually have to fight a far more complex security challenge. My experience in Sri Lanka reinforces this larger understanding. The LTTE, probably one of the most efficient terror organizations the world has seen, it sustained a prolonged conflict against the Sri Lankan state and at one stage against Indian forces. Such endurance was possible only because of strong financial and logistical networks extending well beyond its national boundaries. The lesson is clear. Violent movements endure not only because they can fight, but because they can finance their ability to fight. Let me now turn briefly to Jammu and Kashmir. The reduction in terror incidents is a positive development. It reflects sustained effort and effective operations. However, reduced violence must not be mistaken for the disappearance of the threat. Terror financing networks often adapt themselves. They go underground, preserve capability, and wait for opportunities. I would like to commend the Indian intelligence agencies and particularly the National Investigation Agency for their significant work in disrupting these networks. This had had a real impact on the ground situation in J&K. But this effort must remain continuous. Financial and facilitative networks are often wider and more resilient than they generally appear. We must also place this challenge in the context of the wider strategic environment. The arc around India, from Afghanistan to West Asia and the Gulf, remains unstable. When conflicts are prolonged and poorly stabilized, they leave behind networks, weapons, and trained actors. We have seen before how such conditions gave rise to new extremist formations. The emergence of ISIS or Daesh was one such example. There is no guarantee that similar conditions will not produce new threats in different forms. Essentially, I'm referring to the conditions existing at the moment in West Asia. And when such ecosystems emerge, narcotics and illicit finance are among the first tools that they exploit. They offer cash, secrecy, and reach. There is also a new dimension we must recognize: the rise of synthetic drugs. Unlike traditional narcotics, synthetic drugs are not tied to geography alone. They depend on precursor chemicals, covert laboratories, and supply chains that can operate within national boundaries. This means the threat is no longer only external. It can also emerge internally. Our response must therefore evolve accordingly. We need stronger financial monitoring, better intelligence integration, scrutiny of chemical and pharmaceutical supply chains, enhanced maritime vigilance, and improved cyber capabilities. Above all, you must place financial disruption at the center of our strategy. If you disrupt the money, you weaken the network. If you weaken the network, you reduce violence. And if you reduce violence, you automatically strengthen the state. So now let me conclude. Narco-terrorism is a complex and an insidious threat. It funds violence, corrodes governance, damages society, and creates parallel systems of power. India cannot afford complacency in this domain. Our geography, our neighborhood, and our security environment demand sustained vigilance. This conference is therefore both timely and necessary. I compliment the organizers for bringing together experts and practitioners to address this challenge. If we are to succeed, and we must remember one central truth, the fight against narco-terrorism will not be won by intercepting just drugs. It will be won by dismantling the financial and the operational networks that sustain violence. The networks all over some of our prone areas. That is the task before us. Thank you and Jai Hind.